Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, resilience, crisis management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we're going to be talking about capabilities. And you may recognize our guest. He's been on the show, what, 4 times now? 4 or 5?
That's about right. Maybe five if you include maybe joining with other guests.
Yeah, 5 times. I'd like to return for his fifth time then, or maybe sixth then if you have been on five, so somewhere around there. Sixth time, we'll say. Mark Armour. Mark, welcome back.
Thanks, Alex. It's good to be here. It feels like it's been a while, so
It
we've
has.
probably got a lot of ground to cover. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it has been a while since the last time we talked, and we've talked about all kinds of things over the years, off and on,
Indeed.
with Dr. David Linstead, talking about your book there, Adaptive Business Continuity, and now today we're going to be talking about capabilities. So
Looking forward to it.
why don't we jump straight into it?
Sure. Let's go for it. Let's go for it.
So let's ask the obvious question. What do you mean by capability?
By capability, I'm talking about the capability to respond to or recover from some kind of outage or disruption or disaster. Um, So I look at capabilities as we can't look at just capability. We have to look at the contributing factors to capability. So for an organization or for a department or for a team, even for an individual, those capabilities are made up of things like resources. Those could be IT resources, physical resources like equipment. It could be forms, plans, things of that nature. Uh, Another contributor to capability is confidence. So this is kind of the knowledge, the expertise, the experience needed among the people within the team or the organization or the department. Another one that I find particularly important that I don't think we talk about enough within our space is what I call empowerment or authority. So
Mm.
what kind of latitude did people have to make decisions, to act, to call the shots, mobilize resources, make decisions for their teams, for their customers, for their stakeholders? Um, those are the three main ones. There's others, right? So in the adaptive world, remember we're adaptable, we're flexible. So there's others that I haven't yet added to my program, but I think might be worth mentioning and might be worth considering for other programs. I look at diversity as potentially one contributor. There's a lot of research out there that demonstrates that decisions made in consideration of a variety of different perspectives and backgrounds generally lead to better outcomes. I believe when responding to a disaster disruption, the more different voices you can bring to the table, the better the outcome, rather than being driven just by a sole individual or decision maker. Um,
Is
other
that diversity in thinking in responding, can that also be a part of preparing, like when you're building plans or mitigation activities and things like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the whole planning process, right? You should absolutely include as many different diverse perspectives as possible, right? And I think sometimes we tend to think of diversity from one perspective, which may be purely cultural or ethnic diversity, but we have to consider the cognitive diversity. So we have to consider people of different backgrounds, different experiences, different levels of understanding and expertise. Even people maybe with different, we might consider them disabilities or different ableness. Those are always important considerations. I think we tend to think of people, whether we're talking about somebody within, say, a community, what we might consider disabled, like a blind community or deaf community, or even underserved or underprivileged communities as requiring more help or assistance. But I always look at it as these are people who sometimes they can contribute more than we really realize. And the contributions they can make can greatly inform the work that we do in both
Mm.
preparing, but also in responding. There is some emerging research that actually supports the idea that underprivileged or underserved communities are actually more resilient than maybe more privileged communities. The argument really is only that the more privileged communities simply have resources. That doesn't necessarily make them more what I would call resourceful. They're not as
Mm.
creative. They're not as innovative. They're not as capable of coming up with uh, unusual or creative solutions to problems that other communities, individuals, and teams may. So when we talk about things like diversity, I think there's a whole host of things that we should consider both in planning as well as in response that we don't normally consider. Either we don't consider or we don't consider, I think, in the right way.
That's true because it really comes down, we have to change our thinking because some of those other communities, they've been through some of the, it's terrible to say, but some of them have been through hardships already.
Yep.
And they're already being underserved, underserviced, or neglected, really, in
Yep.
some instances. But they're still able to carry on. So when a quote unquote disaster occurs, they're better equipped
Yep.
than other people.
Exactly.
And we have to change our thinking because you said it well, our traditional thinking is we need to help them. Well, sometimes they've already got the answers on what they need and what they need to do and what's important because they've been there already. We have to
Exactly.
change our thinking. If we change our thinking, hey, we don't have to do provide this community one or two things, and then they're fine. We have to focus on this other group that thinks they're fine, are the ones who are more
Yeah.
exposed.
100%. We sometimes think we just need to give them resources, but a lot of times maybe they need support. Maybe they just need connection to the resources that are available to them. Maybe it's the ability to connect with one another. But also in responding and recovering, their voice is extremely important. There is also another area where there's some research that demonstrates a lot of communities that have been devastated by disasters in the past and are now in the rebuilding process seem to have been rebuilt only with very small amount of voices at the table. They tend to be the ones of people who are in positions of power and people who are in positions of privilege. And the result is you wind up with a recovery that only serves a very narrow band of people within that community, and most everybody else gets left off. And that's sad that people who need the support don't get it. But again, we're robbing ourselves because communities are much richer when they have representation from a wide variety of different backgrounds and
Right.
perspectives. Like I said, it's the richness that's really, really important. And when we don't consider that in our recovery and rebuilding efforts, everybody suffers as a result.
Agreed. Agreed. I want to circle back to your definition of capabilities because in your definition of capabilities, you mentioned skills.
Yes.
But a lot of people tend to uh, use capabilities and skills interchangeably. And I know I've experienced it. I've been in meetings where people are talking about their capabilities, but what they're really talking about and what they go on to define is skills. So
Yeah.
what's the difference between the two?
Sure, sure. So I think they could be interchangeable in a certain context, right? If you're talking about the context of a very specific job or task or function, then you could potentially use them interchangeably. But when we're talking about planning, and particularly when we're talking about response and recovery, it's much, much broader. So the
Mm.
skills, absolutely, part of that is the competence that individuals bring to bear. And those could be skills that can be brought to bear to mobilize resources or to leverage resources. Maybe their collaboration or communication skills. But in the context of response and recovery, we also have to consider resources, right? I don't consider resources part of skills or expertise or competence. I don't consider authority. I don't consider empowerment part of skills or capabilities. Or I shouldn't say capabilities, should part of that skills or expertise component. So within a very narrow definition, I think they're somewhat interchangeable, but in this definition, capabilities is much more encompassing. Skills are a part of it, but also the empowerment, the diversity, and the resources that you need.
So you just have to pay attention to what people are talking about to understand where they are,
Correct.
where they're coming
Yeah, yes, yes.
from.
We tend to get very bogged down with terminology, and sometimes we wind up um, the strictness of our definitions sometimes puts us at odds with one another. And I think if we were a little bit more open to different definitions, and again, if we put things in the proper context as we're discussing them, then I think we're always in a better position.
Yeah, I think that's probably what happened in some of the meetings where I've been, where people were talking about capabilities and they only mentioned this small piece. It's like, okay, well, what about these other pieces then? Well, no, when I talk capabilities, I'm just talking about this. Okay, fine. You know,
Got
I'm not going to correct you. Everyone at the table understands it then. So we'll leave it at that, right? To
it.
your
Oh,
point.
yep, yep. In fact, I mean, and I'm thinking about this as we're talking, right? Um, at an individual level, right? I think capability and skill may be more interchangeable, but when we're talking about business continuity, organizational preparedness, and organizational recovery, then we're talking about teams, we're talking about departments and divisions, and their capabilities are obviously the skills and capabilities the individuals bring to the table, but then we also have to consider the resources that they have available to them, the level of authority and empowerment that they have, how diverse are the individuals that make up that team, that organization, or that group.
Right. So how do we go about identifying our capabilities then? Either at a personal level or we're mostly talking about organizations here. So
Yeah,
maybe we'll stay at that level,
sure.
the organizational level. How do we go about identifying then our capabilities?
So it's surprisingly simple. It's in my view, and my approach is probably just ask people, ask the members of the team, ask represented kind of a representative sampling of a department, right? You might have a department that's 1 or 200 people. You could survey them all if that was the direction that you wanted to go. But maybe 10%, maybe 20 individuals is enough. And here's the thing is I think the immediate reaction is going to be, well, we want something more objective, right? If I'm simply asking people what's the capability that you have available to you, it becomes a little bit more subjective. But I think it should be subjective by design. I'm not interested in, I mean, to an extent, I'm interested in, do you have resources and equipment sitting there or maybe immediately available for mobilization or for access? Certainly I have some interest in, is authority strictly defined for the people who might have to make decisions? But honestly, what's more important is what's that individual's perception? They might have a documented set of authority, but if they're not aware of it and they think they have limited authority and empowerment to take action, that's what they're going to act on. So it doesn't matter that Mark Armour objectively sees that it's written somewhere. If the perception is that it doesn't exist, that's the far more important factor. That's where we kind of get down to perception is reality.
Mhm.
There may be a wealth of resources available to the team in that organization, but if people don't know those resources exist, or they don't know how to access those resources, then for all intents and purposes, those resources do not exist. So, so it's really just a matter of asking people. And there's a multitude of ways we could do that, right? We could sit down and speak with them individually, one-on-one, keeping in mind that's a lot more time consuming, but it gives you much more rich information, right? When somebody says, "Oh, I don't have any of the resources," well, what resources do you think you need in order to respond to this particular type of loss? Then you have deeper conversations. The other end of the spectrum is you could simply send an online survey to as many people as you want, and then from there kind of analyze, well, what's the general perception of what's available. But even that approach gives you some data to act on. You might have 20 people within a group who have a greatly divergent set of perceptions around what the resources are that are available, the authority that they have, the competence and skills that exist within the team. And that's an opportunity to bring people together. Maybe it's a combination of approaches, a survey, but then maybe a group discussion to say, hey, let's find out why there's this wide range of perceptions here and see if we can close that gap, or maybe bring people to a common understanding of what that capability actually looks like. And then from there, you can, the primary benefit of this is you now have an understanding of what actions you can take to improve your capabilities.
Is that like a what I just had the gap analysis, like performing a gap analysis?
I do, so I'm not a fan of the term gap analysis, and that's because the gap analysis is kind of that's what I would call like an artifact of the traditional business continuity approach, where you define objectives for recovery, and then where you have things that fall short of what your objective or target is, that's where you close that gap. In the adaptive world, we're not defining objectives for recovery. We're simply understanding what's the capability that exists today in order to improve. So we're not closing gaps. We're just simply making things better in incremental steps.
Okay.
And just to kind of clarify, I think directionally both might lead people in the same general vicinity, right? You've got a target here. If you're sitting here incrementally, you're going to maybe eventually get to where you want to go. But I think by taking the continuous improvement approach and you're not focused on a target, I think it makes you much more flexible, right? Because you can continually reevaluate where you currently sit and what you want to do to improve. It also, by not defining targets, you don't put yourself in a position where maybe the target you defined last year based on the organization's strategic priorities at that time are no longer aligned because you've got a new leadership, or we're in a new environment where maybe there's new priorities or new markets or new products and strategies being adopted. So in that view, I think the adaptive approach is a little bit more flexible. And again, generally gets you where you're going, but I think provides more opportunities to fine tune the direction that you go each time that you do it.
So what happens if you've identified your capabilities and you know you're here? Then 2 weeks later, you've got a crisis, a disaster, an incident, event, whatever you want to call it, and you find out that some of the things you identified and you thought you had, you really don't have. How do you bring those two together? Is it the same approach that you just kind of used? Because you're just going through a disaster right now and you're finding
Yep.
out you're going into it thinking, oh, we're not as bad as I thought we were. We're actually worse.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you bring those together?
I think two ways, right? So you bring a really good point up, which is there's really no better way to assess your capabilities than during an actual
Yeah.
event.
Yeah.
One of the things I say too is I gave two examples of how you might assess capabilities, like an online survey or maybe like one-on-one discussions or group discussions. An exercise might also be a perfect way to assess capabilities. So short of an event, walk through a scenario. And that's an opportunity to say, all right, if you're responding, what resources would you guys pull from? Who's going to be the decision maker? And if you didn't have communications with leadership to tell you what to do you feel like you've got the authority to make those decisions and take those actions? But then the next step from there is using actual events. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And of course, that's going to give you probably much more accurate data around your capabilities. So we move from the subjective maybe to the more objective. Um, the benefit, right, is you gave the example, maybe you've assessed your capabilities and then 2 weeks later you have an event. I think the benefit is when that event occurs, at least at that point, you have a realistic expectation of what you're capable of. And you have a better understanding of, okay, where were the potential issues that we saw? Did we see like a really, really low level of authority or empowerment? And that becomes an opportunity to say, all right, let's make sure going into this event, we grant people the authority or make them aware of the authority that they do have. If we find that there's very little resources or knowledge of those resources, that's an opportunity to quickly mobilize those resources or get people access to the resources that they need. And then again, coming out of it, in my view, the results of that event are no different than what the results might be of an actual capabilities assessment or an exercise. They're always going to give you information around what your capabilities look like, and through that, the opportunities you can take to improve. The other thing that an event gives you, right, as you said, when you experience that event, if you've assessed your capabilities going in, that's an opportunity to kind of confirm the things that I thought would give us capability. Have they done so? And the real value is over time, as you experience events, disruptions, maybe even near misses, are the capabilities in alignment with your experience during those events, so that if this department suffered this loss at this point, and the capabilities that we'd assessed shortly before then showed they didn't have very much capability, and true to our anticipation, they really struggled with recovery. But then this team over here, they indicated we've got really high capabilities, and sure enough, when they experienced that event, they came through it relatively unscathed. That simply provides validation that you're measuring the right things, and proof that what you're doing, the direction that you're going, is actually the right one. So I'm actually a big fan of kind of like lowering the threshold for execution of response and recovery. So rather than waiting for the most catastrophic loss, if you have something short of that, but the potential always exists that it could be catastrophic, that's an opportunity to practice. It's an opportunity to learn, and it is an opportunity to validate your capabilities, as well as to measure your experience with what you anticipated based on what we assessed beforehand.
You mentioned measurements. We're going to talk about that in the next segment. I
All
want to
right,
touch on that.
looking forward to it.
But I do want to ask, I couldn't help but think with what we were both going back and forth with there for a bit is, how do you ensure honesty with some of these responses, whether it be an in-person interview or online survey, to make sure that what we're identifying as our capabilities is actually true? People, because I know people are going to look at it in a way of, I'm being assessed,
Yep.
right? And people are always going to pump up their answers to make themselves and their departments, their organization, wherever they are, look better. So how do you assess the true honesty of some of these responses?
Um, I'm probably gonna have two answers here, right? I think first is it's all about trust, right? So we have to have some degree of trust in the people that we're asking these questions of, but they also have to trust in us, right? Because as you say, if they feel like this is an assessment and they're going to be judged based on their responses, that means they don't trust you. So to me, it always starts with, and this has been my experience. I've been doing this now for a multitude of years at my organization. Um, we're always looking for opportunities to engage and to demonstrate our support for the folks within our organization and the work that they do. And then before we even send out these surveys, so we started this process, and as we expand it to other teams and other parts of the organization, we're always establishing it as this is not compliance. No one's going to be penalized or judged for what their response is. We've already socialized with leadership that this is a point in time, and this is a reflection of decisions that have been made in the past, and will enable us to make better decisions in the future. And again, to that point, we always set that expectation with leadership that we're collecting this data, and no one should be penalized for any of this. None of this should reflect negatively on people when we see the results. This is for you to both set a realistic expectation, but also be to help you make better decisions around where you want to improve resilience tomorrow. So that's the first one. But so that's the first answer. The second answer is really the best way to kind of objectively do that is query as many people as you can, right? So generally people are going to be honest, but if you have the outliers who are maybe fudging the numbers and making things look better than they actually are, you're going to see those as outliers within a team.
Yeah, that's true.
So
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. Today, we're talking with Mark Armour about capabilities, and we will be right back.